plus energy. Oil prices pause after surging on Libyan outages, Middle East tension. On the program, we shall be looking at the factors responsible for latest GDP figures with Johnson Chukwu, our financial analyst. The program is Business Express, reaching you from Abuja, Nigeria's capital. I am Musa Abubakar, your guide. And now to talk more on the latest GDP figures, we have an economy and financial analyst. Is the CEO of Cowrie Asset Management. He joins us virtually from Lagos. Mr. Johnson Chukwu, it's a pleasure to see you. It's been a while.
Yes, it's the pleasure is mine. Good morning.
Okay, beautiful. Well, Nigeria's GDP grew by 3.19% in the second quarter of 2024, higher than the 2.51% recorded in the second quarter of 2023. What are the key factors driving this growth, and how sustainable is it in the current economic climate?
Well, let me start by speaking on what are those variables that drove the performance of the economy in the second quarter of the year. One is the telecommunications sector that grew at almost 20%. And remember that telecom sector, or ICT sector, is now the largest contributor to the GDP. Then you also look at the oil and gas sector. And if you look at the oil and gas sector, you also saw an improvement based on improvement in crude production compared to the crude production in the second quarter of last year. Then agricultural sector, of course, if you look at agricultural sector growth, it grew by only 1.4% in the second quarter of this year compared to about 1.5% it grew in the second quarter of last year. But it's an improvement over the growth in the first quarter of this year when it grew at 0.18%. So if you see an increase in agricultural growth rate from 0.18% in the first quarter of this year to 1.4% in the second quarter, and consider the agricultural sector accounts for almost a quarter of the Nigerian GDP, then the impact of that growth is among the factors that drove the GDP growth from about 2.98% in the first quarter of this year to about 3.19% in the second quarter of this year.
Okay, the services sector recorded a growth of 3.79%, contributing 58.76% to the aggregate GDP. What specific areas within the services sector are contributing most to this growth? And what does this indicate about the structural changes in Nigeria's economy?
Well, I had mentioned the issue of our ICT sector.
Okay.
That grew at almost 20%. Then you talk of the financial services sector that also grew. And these are the major contributors, the major drivers of the services sector. And you're talking of sectors that are growing that also have impact in terms of the size on the economy. Because what you have to bear in mind that when a sector is very inconsequential and is even growing at fast rate, it won't have material impact on the overall GDP. So the service sector growth about 3.7% was driven largely by the ICT sector, the financial services sector, and then you have the professional services that also grew. But if you look at that, you also observe that transport sector actually suffered a decline. Of course, we know the issues around the transport sector, where scarcity, issues around insecurity that constrain people from moving around. So, and then you also bring in the fact that over these few years, people hardly, advancement in technology has also reduced the need for people to commute. So we've seen the transport sector suffer some level of consistent decline over time. So you have to bring it into a lot of things into context, fuel scarcity issues, insecurity issues, and what have you. But the basic thing is that the major driver of the services sector performance is the ICT sector.
Okay, is this
And the other part
development
of
is
the equation
something
is
that, okay, is this development something
the
that
other
we can
aspect of
relate with the, okay, you go ahead.
okay, I said the other aspect of your question is it sustainable? The reality is that our economy should be growing at above 3%. So we should be striving to ensure we are seeing a consistent growth in our GDP. This economy used to grow in the region of 7%, 7.5%. And given that there's no matured sector of the economy, no single matured sector of the economy. So sustaining this kind of growth, you need to do a few things. There's the issue of insecurity. So you see improvement in food production. Should the agriculture sector start growing at the region of 4-5%, you will see an economy that is growing at almost 7%. Then improve energy supply to the manufacturing sector so that you have the real sector also growing, not just the service sector. Because why is it that service sector is growing in the economy that is having a weak overall GDP growth? Because it does not require some of the critical resources that the real sector requires. It doesn't rely so much on power supply. And for those who are in the like of ICT sector, they basically generate their power. So if we get the right with infrastructure and insecurity, you're going to see further improvement in oil and gas production, which you see an improvement in oil and gas sector growth. You're going to see an improvement in agricultural sector growth. And then you also, with infrastructure, you're going to see improvement in this sector growth rate. So is it sustainable? Yes. Do we know what to do? We should know what to do. Are we doing those things? That's a huge question.
Okay. Okay. Now, would you say that the current reforms by the federal government is actually impacting on this economy? And how do we develop a mature sector? You talked about we don't have actually a mature sector. How do we develop that?
Okay, in terms of the impact of the current policies, I think it's too early because there's always what we call lag effect. That lag effect will mean that a policy decision taken today will have some time to reflect on economic variables. I have talked about the factor that drove growth. I'd mentioned the issue of oil and gas sector. I mentioned the issue of improvement in agricultural sector. But agriculture is growing at 1.4%. It's still inconsequential, given that our population is growing about 2.4%. I mentioned the issue of growth in the telecommunications sector. These sectors cannot really, so you can't say exclusively that they are drawing their performance from policy reforms. Hopefully the policy reform will begin to have impact in the near future. What's the second aspect of your question?
Okay, the second aspect of the question is whether we could develop a particular sector. You said it's mostly we don't have a particularly mature sector that we are focusing on.
Yes, as
how do we
today,
develop?
We don't have a mature
How do we
sector.
develop one?
You know, the truth is that it has to be from policy actions, policies enunciated and implemented by government. And I'm going to give you a practical example that we have experienced as a country. This country used to be a net importer of cement. Today, we're a net exporter of cement. It wasn't by accident. It wasn't by happenstance. It was because a policy was implemented that encouraged investment in the cement sector. And over time, we have seen that sector grow into a sector that could export its products. We can replicate that in several sectors. And that's only way. It has to come from policy consistency. Policies that are driven with the primary objective to incentivize investment, to give investors the benefits for quick growth. I had mentioned, and then supported by critical infrastructure. Transport infrastructure is very critical. Logistical infrastructure, which includes airports and seaports, the rail lines are part of the transport infrastructure. Then today we're also talking of a new introduction into the infrastructure divide, broadband internet services. That will also further drive growth in the critical service sectors of the economy.
Okay, given the importance of the agricultural sector to Nigeria's food security, how do these growth figures impact the broader goals of ensuring food availability and affordability?
You know, I've always said this, which I made reference to earlier, that if the agricultural sector is growing about 4-5%, or 3-4-5%, we should see a GDP that is growing above maybe in the region of 4, 5, 6, 7%. You see, if you look at the inflation figure for the month of July, you observe that inflation figure dropped from 34.19% to 33.4%. What was the sole factor that drove a decline in inflation? It was food inflation, and principally because we are in the harvest season, and also that is also dovetailing back into the GDP growth rate. You saw because the harvest season is around this period, we saw a GDP that improved. And I did a trend analysis of the GDP growth rate over time. Every second quarter of the year, we see an improvement in GDP. For us to have food security, which is a critical component of national security, we must address the issue of food production, and that will be coming from issue of fighting insecurity in the major food base of the country. If we are able to address the issue of insecurity, we're going to see an improvement in food production. Remember that our food production is largely subsistence farming. So the farmers are still farming with hoes and cutlasses. So if you displace them from the farms, you realize that it will flush into your food inflation and lead to what we call here food insecurity. But beyond the issue of insecurity, addressing the fear of insecurity in the major food base of the country, we also need to modernize agriculture. We need to address the issue of land use acts, smallholder farming, and commercial agricultural farming. We need to address the issue of irrigation so that we improve on productivity of that cultivated land. Those are factors we need to drive agriculture. It is absolutely critical that we have food security as a country. As we speak today, Nigeria cannot go into war, because should we go into war and they block the seaports, we are all dead because we cannot feed ourselves.
Okay, another thing, when you look at the federal government's goal of achieving $1 trillion economy, how far are we from that, and what do we need to put in place to actually, get to that particular, position?
Well, I'm going to start from a very interesting perspective to it. I think the first thing is to revise the timeline that the government has stipulated to achieve a $1 trillion economy. Our economy has actually dropped below $300 billion. So assuming we start growing at $300 billion, from $300 billion, growing at 3% or even 5%, we are not going to achieve $1 trillion in 10 years. So we have to be a bit more realistic. Two, we need to identify growth sectors of the economy. We've seen the telecommunications that 20 years ago was an inconsequential contributor to the GDP, almost accounting for 20% of the GDP. Then we need to address those sectors, and we have many of them. The agricultural sector is one area we have competitive advantage. The solid mineral sector is an area we have competitive advantage. Because of the size of our market, the domestic market, we should be a manufacturing hub. So we need to address those issues. These are factors that are not going to be addressed conclusively in a matter of 2-3 years, because you're not going to build a world-class infrastructure that will support Nigeria becoming competitive with production in China or Vietnam. So I think the first thing is adjust the timeline to focus on areas you have competitive advantage and invest in those areas in terms of policy, in terms of factor inputs, and then incentives to the private sector to invest in those sectors. And then we should, once we begin to see a growth rate of 6-7%, we will now effectively project when we'll achieve 1 trillion naira. But it's not impossible for this country to achieve 1 trillion naira. Look at where India is today, and look at the way they were 20 years ago. And look at what is happening in Vietnam. And so countries have proven this, and we have the potentials. But potential is not enough. We need to now fully exploit those potentials to be reality.
Okay, potential is not enough. We need to explore these potentials. It's a pleasure having you on the program, Johnson Chukwu, and we look forward to actually engaging you more.
Thank you for having me.
Beautiful.